Welcome back again to our continued series on the glories of our beloved Sri Vrindavan Dham. I'm happy to be with you. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Deshatarane. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So, today we'll be moving on from our previous little series on Govardhan Hill, and we'll be discussing a new pastime place in Vrindavan, and that is the forest of Kamyavan. And in speaking about Kamyavan, the Adi Varaha Purana says, quote, also called Kamavana, Kamyaka, and Kamya Kavana, this fourth forest of Vrindavan qualifies pilgrims who visit to relish the Lord's abode by freeing them from sinful reactions and blessing them with pure devotion. Unquote. So Kamyavan. Of course, we've discussed the forest of Kamyavan before in 3 lectures actually in May, but I came across more information as I was studying, and it's interesting. There's a lot more to discuss. I think about any holy place in Vrindavan, of course, the pastimes are unlimited and the glories of that place are unlimited, so you could speak forever about any holy place in Braj. About Kamyavan, we find in Narahari Chakravarti's Bhakti Ratnakara, 5th wave, Raghava Acharya says, quote, Kamyavan has so many holy places that it's impossible to mention them all, unquote. So the bulk of the new information I found centers around the Pandavas stay in Kamyavan during their 13-year exile. As we mentioned in our previous lectures on Kamyavan, Yudhishthir, Bhima, Arjun, Nakul, Sahadev, they lived in Kamyavan during that exile. You can remember that we discussed in detail the pastime at Dharmakund, where Yudhishthir successfully answered 100 questions posed by Yamaraj and to bring his brothers back to life after they'd drank the water of that poisonous lake. But there's much more to their pastimes in Kamyavan. Actually, they moved there immediately after they were forced into exile. And those 13 years, they were in and out, you could say, of Kamyavan. But they spent a good amount of time there. Actually, perhaps we should begin by discussing how these 5 great Kshatriyas and their wife Draupadi, who were meant to live in royalty in nearby Indraprastha, ended up as forest dwellers in Vrindavan. Of course, no harm being a forest dweller in Vrindavan. I would like to be, but they were Kshatriyas. Well, to begin with, we know there was always animosity between the Pandavas and their cousin brothers, the Kauravas. Cousin brothers means that their fathers, Pandu and Dhritarashtra, were brothers. That made them cousin brothers. They're always at odds with each other, practically from the beginning. And it culminated at one point in a gambling match in Hastinapur, where the Kauravas were living. And this gambling match, the motto of the gambling match was that the winner takes all, so to speak, including the kingdom. And as fate would have it, the 5 Pandava brothers lost that gambling match. And part of the deal of the gambling match is that whoever lost, they had to go to the forest for 13 years in exile. And the 13th year they had to live incognito. And if they were discovered, they would lose their opportunity to come back and rule the kingdom. So the Pandavas lost, and they honored that deal, and they left. It's described they left aside their chariots and carrying their weapons. The Mahabharata says they traveled in a westerly direction, passing through Kurukshetra, and after crossing several sacred rivers, they came to the Jamuna River, and they crossed over the Jamuna River into Vrindavan, into the Kamyaka forest, Mahabharata says. But again, the Kamyavan forest. It says it took them 3 days. And that makes sense because previously Hastinapur and Indraprastha, they, well, sort of in the area of Delhi, you could say, something like that. Vrindavan's not that far from Delhi or from those previous big cities. So it only took them 3 days to come to Kamyavan. And it says when they arrived, and they saw on the Jamuna River many saints and sages performing sacrifices and austerities. And as nighttime fell, they continued going deeper into the Kamyavan forest to find a place to rest for that night, when suddenly they came upon a terrible Rakshasa who lived in Kamyavan. And he's described as being as tall as a tree, and he held a blazing torch, and he had 8 fangs protruding from a wide open mouth, and his eyes were the color of copper, and he had flaming red hair that was standing erect. And he was roaring like thunder, which, quote, I'm quoting Mahabharata, spread Rakshasa illusion everywhere. Rakshasa illusion everywhere, which temporarily confused the Pandavas. And simply from hearing that demon's awful roaring, it's described birds and other creatures fell down everywhere. And deer, buffaloes, leopards, bears, they fled in all directions. And a violent wind blew up, causing dust clouds to swirl everywhere. A horrifying scene. And when Draupadi saw this horrifying creature, she closed her eyes and stood amidst her husbands, as described, like an agitated river amid 5 hills. So then Yudhishthir, elder brother Yudhishthir, he confronted this Rakshasa. And he said, "Who are you? And what do you want of us?" And the Rakshasa replied, "I am Kirmira, and I live in this forest of Kamyavan, and I eat men foolish enough to come here. And who are you all that you have come today to be my food?" So Yudhishthira answered proudly, "We are the 5 sons of Pandu, and we have been exiled from our kingdom for 13 years, and we have come to spend our time in the sacred forest of Kamyavan." So the Rakshasa, he just said, "Then first I shall devour Bhima." So Shastra says that Bhima, he's a Kshatriya, they're always ready to fight. It says, Bhima, always eager for combat, took up a huge tree and stripping it of its branches, he rushed forward to face the demon. Then just as Indra throws his thunderbolt, Bhima brought that tree down upon the Rakshasa's head, and the tree smashed to pieces, but the demon was unfazed, a powerful demon. So then Kirmira, he had this blazing torch, he threw it at Bhima, and Bhima, he dropped to the ground, very kind of like casually, and he lifted his left foot and kicked that flaming torch away. So at that point, the Rakshasa, he tore up a big tree and he rushed at Bhima. And for the next hour, the demon and Bhima, they were tearing up this tree and that tree and hurling and beating each other with the trees for a good hour. And finally, Bhima just caught the Rakshasa and threw him down. Then he took hold of the demon by his waist. It's described. He began shaking him as trees are shaken by the wind. And finally, placing his knees on the chest of this demon, strangled him to death. So welcome to the Kamyavan forest. And then after that, the Pandava brothers and Draupadi, they entered deeper into the forest. And the next morning, dressed in deerskins, they dressed in deerskins as sages because they were going to be living in the forest for so long. And they built thatched huts to live in. And then I thought it was very interesting. I read that in the company of pious Brahmins, they began to devote their time to sacrifice and study of the scriptures. Like many of us, we don't have our routine duties anymore, so we're engaged in sacrifice and study of the scriptures. All over the world, devotees. So now, when Krishna, who at this particular point was living in Dwarka, he obviously left Vrindavan, and he was living in Dwarka, when he heard the news that the Pandavas had been exiled, he decided to go and see them personally in the Kamyavan forest. So he took Balaram and Subhadra with him, and they journeyed all the way from Dwarka to Sri Vrindavan Dham. They entered into the Kamyavan forest. And, they came to see the Pandavas, obviously. And I was thinking how much different it was from the time when Krishna was younger and spending his time in Vrindavan. So much different. His Brajalila pastimes with the Gopas and the Gopis. Actually, those pastimes that Krishna had with the Gopis and the Gopas in Kamyavan forest, in particular, they're described by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. I came across that. In his Sri Braja Riti Chintamani chapter 3, he describes Krishna being in Kamyavan in the early days. He writes, to the south and west of Nandishwara Hill is Kamyavan forest and many other beautiful places where the divine couple enjoyed many confidential pastimes. As Sri Sri Radha Madhava conversed during their wonderful pastimes in Kamyavan, they manifest a transcendental sweetness that astonishes their gopi friends. Because of its many charming Kamya forests, groves and lakes where Lord Krishna relishes the sweetness of his pastimes, this place is forever known as Kamyavan. So, of course, those are super excellent pastimes. And as we know, Krishna, he's partial to the Brajabasis. But we should also understand that he loves all his devotees and is eager to fully reciprocate their love with him at any time, regardless of whatever rasa they have with him. In the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, we hear Narada Muni glorify the special love that the Pandavas had or have for Krishna, and Krishna has for the Pandavas. And this is why he's coming to the Kamyavan forest to see them. Narada Muni glorifies them, and it's in part 1, chapter 5, verse 32. He says to the Pandavas, Narada, O great saintly Pandavas, is anyone bold enough to let his tongue describe the unique love for Krishna that each of you has? Or the special mercy he bestows upon you? What's more, in the Mahabharata, I found in Udyoga Parva 88 and 89, we hear Krishna himself say how much he loves the Pandavas. He says, Yastan dvishtvi samam dvishti, yastan anu samam anu. Katyam dharma vidihi, pandavayar dharma charibihi. Quote, he who hates the Pandavas hates me, and he who follows them follows me. Know that I am one in spirit with the righteous Pandavas. I'll recite that again. Krishna says, he who hates the Pandavas hates me, and he who follows them follows me. Know that I am one in spirit with the righteous Pandavas. And in this way, Krishna's not, he favors the Brajabasis, but you could say he has undivided love for all his devotees. And that's very clear when Kaviraj Goswami is describing Lord Chaitanya in Anchalila 281. Premavasa Gora Prabhu Yahan premotana, premavasahasa taha dena darshana. And I quote, Lord Gaurasundara is greatly influenced by the love of his devotees. Therefore, wherever there is pure devotion to the Lord himself, subdued by such love, appears, and his devotees see him. So when Krishna came into the Kamyavan forest and he saw Yudhishthira and his brothers dressed in deer skins and stripped of their kingdom, both he and Balaram were enraged. And Krishna actually said very loudly, I cannot tolerate this injustice. He was very angry. So Mahabharata describes that Arjuna and the Pandavas, they'd accepted their fate. And they were very virtuous persons, so they didn't want to break their promise to follow whatever result came of the gambling match. So Arjuna, he tried to pacify Krishna. He said to him, O Krishna, as Narasimha, you slew the mighty Asura Hiranyakashipu. As Aditi's son, Vamana, you spanned the entire universe with 3 steps. O soul of all beings, covering the heavens, you dwell in the body of the sun and imbue him with your own effulgence. O Krishna, there is no limit to your glories. Then Draupadi came forward, and it's described in her soft deerskin clothes, and said, my dear beloved Krishna, you are the refuge of all ascetics and sages. Even as children sport with their toys, you sport with the celestials. Those seeking your protection are never overcome by calamity. O Krishna, you are my only shelter. I request your protection now in this dangerous forest for 4 reasons. Number 1, due to our family relationship. Number 2, our friendship. Number 3, the respect you bear for me. And number 4, the very fact that you are my Lord. So Arjuna's trying to calm Krishna down, and Draupadi, she's a princess, and she's in the forest, and it's dangerous, so she's approaching the Lord, asking for his protection. So Krishna replied specifically to Draupadi. He said, O fair lady, do not grieve. I shall do for you and the Pandavas whatever lies within my power. The heavens may fall, and the Himalayan mountains may move. The earth may be spent, and the ocean may dry up. But know for certain, O Draupadi, that my words will never prove false. Then Krishna stood up to leave, because he realized he couldn't do anything to save them from being in exile for 13 years, if only because, again, the Yudhishthira and his brothers were too virtuous to break their word, as described in Mahabharata. And he knew they'd be remaining there in the forest for 13 years, but he promised Draupadi that he would protect them. And he knew, of course, there would be a battle later on in which the Kauravas would be annihilated and the Pandavas would be reinstated. So then Krishna, it's described, Krishna left the forest on his golden chariot, which shone like the sun. And the one acharya, he concludes this pastime, it's interesting, by saying or writing, quote, tribulations continued to beset the Pandavas, even in Krishna's land. But because they were absorbed in talks of Krishna's Braja Leela pastimes, their stay in Kamyavan was amongst the best of their lives. So I was thinking, we're all in compromised situations now, and there's difficulties, sometimes tragedies in the world now. We're all experiencing something to some degree. But here we hear about how, who can imagine what the Pandavas are going to go through in their 13-year exile? So many problems, so many difficulties, etc. But at least during their stay in Kamyavan, they weren't so much affected because they're always absorbed in Shravanam, Kirtanam, Krishna Smaranam, hearing and chanting about Krishna. So we're doing the same. We're bearing through this pandemic by having these classes on Braj Leela. As Jesus said, to be in this world but not of this world. So, yeah. So Kamyavan, it proved true to its name. It stated that it's a place where all devotees' desires to be with the Lord are fulfilled. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he writes like that in his Braja Riti Chintamani. What is it? 351, quote. The word kama means desire. And because the fulfillment of every kind of spiritual desire is perfected in this forest, many charming groves and lakes, it's always been known as Kamyavan. So there's more pastimes with the Pandavas in Kamyavan. Actually, one day, several months into their stay in the Kamyavan forest, the Pandava brothers had gone away from camp. I believe it says in Mahabharata they went away for hunting, which Kshatriyas did do. But they left Draupadi behind in the care of some local Brahmins. And at that time, a king named King Jayadratha was passing through Kamyavan with a small army on his way to getting married to a princess named Salyadesha. And as he was passing through the forest, he happened to see Draupadi picking flowers. And he became lusty after her. And I became curious, who is this Jayadratha? And so I was doing some research, and I was surprised. I found a very lengthy purport, almost 2,000 words, by Srila Prabhupada about this Jayadratha. It's Srimad Bhagavatam. It's in the Srimad Bhagavatam 1:15, text 16. Prabhupada describes a number of personalities, but for a long time he's describing this Jayadratha. And Prabhupada writes that Jayadratha was the king of Sindhu Desh, which is modern Pakistan. And Prabhupada said he was present in the Swayamvara ceremony of Draupadi. A Swayamvara ceremony is when a number of Kshatriyas fight for a girl's hand in marriage. But at that time, Jayadratha, he was unsuccessful. He didn't win Draupadi. But from then on, Prabhupada writes, he was always thinking how to get in touch with her. And now, by chance, whatever, he just came upon her in the Kamyavan forest. So what he did is he sent one of his ministers, Koti Shasha, with a letter of marriage proposal. It was ridiculous because obviously Draupadi is already married to the 5 Pandavas, but he just lost it. He lost it. And he sent a formal letter, will you please marry me? So then Prabhupada writes, because again, Prabhupada wrote extensively on this person. He wrote, Draupadi at once vehemently refused the proposal, but Jayadratha was so much attracted by the beauty of Draupadi that he tried again and again and again, proposing to her, but every time he was refused by Draupadi. Then Prabhupada writes, then Jayadratha tried to take Draupadi forcibly away on his chariot, but Draupadi gave him a good dashing, and he fell like a cut-root tree. Don't mess with these Kshatriya girls. Draupadi gave him a good dashing, and he fell like a cut-root tree. But he was not discouraged, Prabhupada writes, and he was able to force Draupadi to sit on the chariot as he whisked her away. And at that point, I read that Yudhishthira and his brothers, they returned, and they saw Jayadratha just as he was going out of the Kamyavan forest. And Yudhishthira and his brothers, they attacked all the soldiers because Jayadratha had come with a group of soldiers. So the 5 Pandava brothers annihilated the soldiers, and then Bhima caught hold of Jayadratha, and he beat him very severely, but he didn't kill him. Rather, you could say once he did something worse, because for Kshatriyas in particular, we hear in the Gita, for one who has been honored, dishonor is worse than death. So Bhima cut his hair and because Kshatriyas are proud. They dress nicely. They're bold. They're courageous. So their hair, I guess, is important. So he shaved his head, just left a few hairs here and there, making him very embarrassed, dishonored. And Mahabharata relates that Maharaj Yudhishthira was kind enough to have him released. And after this incident, he was allowed to return to his country, but feeling insulted, I found it again interesting that he went to the Himalayan mountains. He went to Gangotri, actually, which is the source of the Ganges in the Himalayas. He went to Gangotri, and there he practiced severe penance and austerity to please Lord Shiva. And when Lord Shiva appeared, he gave Jayadratha a very interesting benediction. The benediction was that whoever caused his head, meaning Jayadratha's head, to fall on the ground in battle would die at once. So what was the benefit of that? Well, who's going to want to fight with him? Because if you fight with him, Jayadratha and his head hits the ground, then you die. So yeah, no one's going to want to fight with him. Well, interesting benediction. So confident with that benediction, he later participated in the battle of Kurukshetra. And he sided, of course, with the Kauravas. And during the fighting, Arjuna, because Arjuna was upset that Yudhishthira let him go, so Arjuna took a vow to kill him. And when hearing this, Jayadratha wanted to leave the battlefield. He actually asked permission from the Kauravas to leave the battle, but they wouldn't let him do it. And he actually ended up fighting with Arjuna. And while the fight was going on, Krishna reminded Arjuna of the benediction that Lord Shiva had given to Jayadratha, that, quote, whoever would cause his head to fall on the ground would die at once. But Arjuna just kept fighting. So Krishna advised Arjuna to, in the fight, sever Jayadratha's head, catch the head before it, this is all Kshatriya talk, catch the head before it fell to the ground, and then throw the head to Jayadratha's father, who was engaged in penances and austerities and Sampataka Panchaka, sorry for my Sanskrit. Samantak Panchaka is a holy place near Kurukshetra. So Arjuna did this. They were fighting and severed his head, caught it before it hit the ground, threw it to Kurukshetra, where Jayadratha's father was meditating. And Prabhupada concludes his purport that I was mentioning, Srimad Bhagavatam, by saying, quote, Jayadratha's father was surprised to see a severed head on his lap, and he at once threw it to the ground. Thus, the father immediately died, his forehead being cracked in 7 pieces. Wow. So, pastimes in Kamyavan with the Pandavas. Now, in a purport in Srimad Bhagavatam 1:15-11, Srila Prabhupada relates another pastime that took place as a result of Duryodhana. Duryodhana is the elder of the Kaurava brothers. As a result of Duryodhana visiting the Pandavas during their exile in Vrindavan in the Kamyavan forest. He went to visit them, but not in a nice way. Duryodhana was especially envious of the Pandavas, more so than the other 100 of his 100 brothers. And even though they'd arranged that the Pandavas had been exiled from the kingdom and they were living like forest dwellers, he wanted to further harass Maharaj Yudhishthira and his brothers. So one time, he left Hastinapur with a small army, and he came to Kamyavan, and he set up camp not far from where the Pandavas and Draupadi were living in their humble thatched huts. And there Duryodhana and his brothers, Duryodhana and his soldiers, they partied very loudly day and night, all day, all night, drinking and rousing this and that, making it impossible for the Pandavas, it's described, even to sleep. He just wanted to harass them. So, seeing this outrageous behavior in the Kamyavan forest, Lord Indra in the heavenly planets, he became furious. Then he sent his commanders and some of his soldiers to arrest Duryodhana. Don't do that to the Pandavas, you rascal. But a big fight ensued. But the demigods, Indra's men, they quickly subdued Duryodhana's army, because most of them were drunk anyway, and they captured Duryodhana. The demigods captured Duryodhana. But again, it's interesting. When reading this pastime, I read that King Yudhishthira, when he came to know that his cousin brother had been kidnapped, when Duryodhana had been kidnapped, he asked Arjuna and Bhima to save him. Now, the Bhima and Arjuna were like, what's a good word, flabbergasted, at being asked to rescue the very person who orchestrated their 13-year exile. But Yudhishthira, you could say he explained an important principle that I think all Vaishnavas should bear in mind. Listen to this. He said, quote, to Bhima and to Arjuna, we may argue and even fight amongst one another as brothers, but when someone from outside our family attacks, we must stand together, united against our common enemy. We may argue and even fight amongst one another as brothers, but when someone from outside our family attacks, we must stand together, united against our common enemy. So as requested, Arjuna and Bhima, they went and defeated the demigods and saved Duryodhana. Unfortunately, Duryodhana took Yudhishthira's gesture of kindness as a sign of humiliation and dishonor, in the sense that he was thinking, my enemy had to rescue me. So he felt, humiliated. My enemy, because he considered Yudhishthira an enemy. So he became even more venomous. So a little later, when he was back in Hastinapur, which is where the Kauravas were staying, a great sage, Durvasa Muni, came to visit them, and he asked Durvasa Muni to go back to Kamyavan and in some way or other embarrass and curse the Pandavas. So they came up with a little plan. And we know that history. We actually discussed that also, that pastime in previous Kamyavan lectures. But just briefly, Durvasa Muni went to Kamyavan and with his 60,000 disciples, and the custom is that when a sage comes with his disciples, you should feed them. But the Pandavas were not able to do that, although they had that Akshaya Patra, that special plate which Draupadi had, which said that she could feed as many people as possible with that pot, Akshaya Patra, that pot. She could feed as many people as possible, but once she took prasadam, that pot for that day would not have that power. So when Durvasa Muni came with his 60,000 disciples, she'd already taken prasadam, so she was in great distress, so they were afraid they were going to be cursed as desired by Duryodhana, cursed by Durvasa Muni. But Krishna came to the rescue, and he took a little piece of prasadam inside that pot that was still there, and he felt fully satisfied. And sometimes it's said, when the Lord is satisfied, everyone is satisfied. So Durvasa Muni and his 60,000 disciples, they all of a sudden got full. They're completely full, so they felt not proper to go and eat something that they thought was being prepared for them, so they left. That's a very brief summary of what we said in detail before. But this was Duryodhana. He wanted to have Durvasa Muni curse them because he felt humiliated. So it all happened in the Kamyavan forest. But sometimes the Pandavas would come and go. They didn't stay all the time, obviously, in the Kamyavan forest. One time, Arjuna, he was getting a little restless, so he decided to go on pilgrimage to visit holy places in the Himalayan mountains. But the other brothers, they stayed behind with Draupadi. They remained in Kamyavan. But Arjuna was gone for quite some time. And as the years passed, the other Pandavas and Draupadis, they started worrying because he wasn't coming back to Kamyavan. But then suddenly one day, a great sage named Lamasha Rishi, he arrived in Kamyavan. And he met with the Pandavas. It's described that when he arrived, he was radiant in his black deerskin, carrying only a water pot. So the Pandavas received the sage, Lamasha Rishi, very nicely, and then they just, how your travel's going? So Lamasha Rishi had some very interesting news for them. He said, "O heroes, while going throughout the worlds, I went to Amaravati, Indra's capital city in Svargaloka. And there I saw the exalted king of the celestials, Indra. And to my astonishment, your brother Arjuna was sharing his throne." Well, we know that actually Arjuna is the son of Indra. And the Rishi continued, "Indra asked me to come to you and assure you of Arjuna's welfare. He's doing fine, don't worry." So then Lamasha Rishi told the Pandavas how Arjuna had acquired a number of celestial weapons in his travels to the holy places in the Himalayan mountains, which included a very famous weapon of Lord Shiva. And also that, quote, he had learned to sing and dance from the Gandharvas. So then the Rishi said to the Pandavas, "Your brother Arjuna asked me to take you to the various tirthas in the Himalayas so that you can gain some pious merits. And Indra also made this request, and it is my desire as well. Although I've already been to those places many times, I am here to accompany you and take you to those holy places at once." So the Pandavas and Draupadi, they'd been in the Kamyavan forest for a while, so they thought, Yudhishthira said, "O exalted Brahman, your words are like a shower of nectar. Please take us and show us all the holy places." And then Yudhishthira turned to the Brahmanas, because while they were in the forest, they had help. There was a group of pious Brahmins who were assisting them in different ways, because they were doing sacrifices and they were studying Shastra, as we mentioned. So these Brahmanas, Yudhishthira turned to them and he said, "O best of men, you may join us, but don't come if you are incapable of bearing hunger, thirst, severe climate, and the fatigue of travel. All those desiring regular meals and living upon cooked food should stay back." So that he's indicating that traveling can be difficult. Traveling is difficult. It says that a cloth becomes old by leaving it in the sun. A woman becomes older by not getting enough attention from her husband. A horse becomes old by not being used. And a man becomes old by traveling. So Yudhishthira was telling the Brahmins, "You're welcome to come, but don't come if you can't take some hunger, some thirst, some severe climate, and the fatigue of travel. And if you're attached to your regular meals of cooked food, you should stay back." So travel can be difficult. And that just brought to my mind, actually, a letter that Prabhupada wrote to my godbrother, Prabhu Vishnu Prabhu, on January 3rd, 1973, wherein Prabhupada was appreciating the fact that Prabhu Vishnu Prabhu was traveling, was undergoing so much inconvenience while traveling in order to spread the Sankirtan movement. It's a wonderful letter, and for me it's been a continued source of inspiration throughout my entire career as a devotee, my entire life as a devotee. What Prabhupada says in that letter, because I've been traveling for so many years, just this last 10 months I had to stop. But how Prabhupada appreciated the sacrifice that a disciple would make when traveling and preaching, it just meant so much to me. And I kind of take that letter as a mission statement in my life. I keep it in my pocket wherever I go, so to speak. A mission statement is described as a single sentence or a paragraph that's used to explain one's purpose for being or existing. Many times companies, they have mission statements. We exist for this, or we're here for that. But people can also make mission statements. So I'll recite that letter. How Prabhupada appreciates that when we as his disciples and his grand disciples, we sacrifice for his heartbeat, which is to give Krishna consciousness to the people of this world. And he writes, "My dear Prabhu Vishnu, please accept my blessings. I beg to acknowledge receipt of your letter dated January 1st, 1973. And I am very glad to hear from you the wonderful news of your traveling party in England. I think the people of that place are becoming more and more inclined for this Krishna conscious movement, for they are inviting you to stay in their homes, they are taking books, and sometimes they are becoming devotees. All of these things are very encouraging signs to me. Simply go on in this way, stopping in every village and city of England and Scotland, distribute books, and hold Sankirtan processions. Answer their questions, distribute prasadam, and whenever possible, and then request the townspeople to arrange some engagements for speaking in their schools or in someone's home or in a hall. In this way, remain always without anxiety for destination or a comfortable situation. Relying only on the mercy of Krishna for your plan. Rely only on the mercy of Krishna for your plan, and just go on preaching his message and selling his books wherever there is interest. I can understand that it is not an easy matter to travel extensively over long periods of time without proper food or rest, and sometimes it must be very cold there also. But still, because you are getting so much enjoyment, spiritual enjoyment from it, it seems like play to you. That is the advanced stage of spiritual life, never attained even by the greatest yogis and so-called gyanis. Let any man see our devotees working so hard for Krishna and say that they are not better than any millions of so-called yogis and transcendentalists. That is my challenge. Because you are rightly understanding through your personal realization this philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Therefore, in such a short time, you have surpassed all the stages of yoga processes to come to the highest point of surrendering to Krishna. That I can very much appreciate. Thank you very much for helping me in this way, hoping this meets you and the other men of your party in the best of health and spirits. Your ever well-wisher, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Prabhupada writes, because you are rightly understanding through your personal realization this philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Therefore, in such a short time, you have surpassed all the stages of yoga processes to come to the point of surrendering to Krishna. Prabhupada appreciates so much. So yeah, I just shared that letter because it's so important to me, and I know to all devotees who do Sankirtan and all devotees who support the Sankirtan mission of Srila Prabhupada that we can be very happy sacrificing all our comforts for Srila Prabhupada, because we get that Paramdrishti Vartante, that higher taste, and when we get his mercy. So anyway, back to Kamyavan. And Maharaj Yudhishthira's request that no one accompany him and his brothers on their journey to holy places unless they're prepared to endure hardships. So the Pandavas, minus Arjuna of course, they left Kamyavan and they went into the Himalayan mountains, and they eventually arrived at Kuvera's celestial abode somewhere very high, because the Himalayas mountains actually go up to Swargaloka. They arrived at Kuvera's abode, and eventually Arjuna came there and met up with them again. And they stayed 4 years there, 4 years. And then they had a desire to come back to Vrindavan. They wanted to come back to Kamyavan. So they came back, but they stopped for just a little while because they wanted to enter Kamyavan in the month of Kartik. I thought that was really nice. Like we're all hankering, right, to be in India, in Vrindavan, in Kartik especially. So I was reading, they waited and they entered during the month of Kartik. And they spent their 12th year, the full 12th year in Kamyavan. And for their 13th year of exile, we mentioned earlier, they lived incognito in Hodal. Hodal is also situated in Vrindavan Dham. It's described as an ancient dwelling place on the southern edge of the sacred forest of Bahulavan. And even today there's a lake there called Pandavakund. Pandavakund, I saw that. So in this way, the Pandavas chose to spend a good amount of time, even though it was in exile, in Sri Vrindavan Dham in the sacred forest of Kamyavan. And hearing that should inspire us to also want to come, not to live in exile, but to come to Vrindavan, to spend time happily chanting and dancing and discussing all these wonderful pastimes in the forests of Sri Vrindavan Dham. And we'll make sure that during our next Kartik Parikrama, we'll definitely go to Kamyavan again and again and again. And a little more research I did. I found out that centuries ago, the whole of Kamyavan was surrounded by a wall. Some devotees built a huge wall, and it had, because it's such a special place, Kamyavan, it's the idea, so they built a wall to protect it. And it had 7 gates that were facing in different directions. And those directions are, one gate faced Setabandhu Kund in the town of Dig. I don't know why. The second gate faced Charana Pahadi, and I couldn't find out what Charana Pahadi was. The third gate faced the deity of Vaishnavi Devi in Punjab. The fourth gate faced what is now Delhi. The fifth faced to Nandagram. The sixth Mathura, and the seventh Varshana. So you could come to, this a few hundred years ago, you could come and then see these 7 gates all facing auspicious directions. And nowadays, there's still many things, wonderful things existing from ancient days, and especially in Kamyavan. There's that famous Dharmakund, which I mentioned earlier, where Yudhishthira saved his 4 brothers. The water's not there, but the lake, the big hole is there for the lake that someone can actually go, one devotee might want to go to as a service to Kamyavan, and renovate that lake, make it beautiful. It's just full of weeds now. And nearby that Dharmakund, there's a famous Pandavakund, where other lakes where the Pandavas bathe. And previously near to the Pandava Kunda was Pandava Kupa. It was a well from which the Pandavas would draw water, and Draupadi would do her washing there. But unfortunately, like many holy sites in Vrindavan, it was plowed under to make agricultural fields, unfortunately. But you can still see, you can see in Kamyavan, you can have darshan of Kameshwara Mahadev, a deity of Lord Shiva that was established by Brajanab, who we spoke about in our last lecture. That Kameshwara Mahadev, he stays there in Kamyavan as the guardian of the Kamyavan forest. And there's a small lake beside that temple that I saw. It's called Manikarnika Kund. Manikarnika Kund. And just yesterday I read that King Vrishabhanu and his wife Kirtida Sundari, when they wanted to start to have children, they made a pilgrimage to Kamyavan. And they went to that temple of Kameshwara Mahadev, and they prayed there with great devotion for his mercy to conceive children. And they bathed with great devotion in Manikarnika Kund. It's described that Maharaj Vrishabhanu didn't want ordinary children, obviously. He wanted children who would complement his family's devotion to the Supreme Lord, it's written. And Lord Mahadevi answered the Lord's prayers. Because as we know, the great Kirtita Sundari gave birth to 3 divine children, one after another. Sridham, one of Krishna's dearest cowherd boyfriends, Vrindavaneshwari, Shrimati Radharani, and Ananga Manjari. They're all intimately connected to Krishna. Of course, the family members of King Vrishabhanu are eternally connected, so they don't require the blessings of Lord Shiva to be united or reunited. But Krishna's associates always follow earthly customs just as he does when they're on the earthly planet, as we see in Vrindavan Dham. Anyway, I pray today's lecture will deepen your appreciation for the sacred forests of Kamyavan, of Vrindavan Dham in general, Krishna, Radha Krishna. And in that regard, we're indebted to the 5 Pandava brothers and Draupadi. They showed us how to remain Krishna conscious in all circumstances, and how to bear tribulations, any tribulations we might come across when we're in Vrindavan. You know, we do get, devotees get typhoid and dysentery. Sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's too cold, like today outside. So we can bear these tribulations here in Vrindavan or anywhere in the world by Shravanam Kirtanam, Krishna Smaranam, hearing and chanting. But a special thank you today to the 5 Pandavas for everything they taught us in their lives by their example, how to be Krishna conscious. In a lecture on Srimad Bhagavatam in Los Angeles on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1973, Prabhupada he spoke about the Pandavas and how we should follow them. In that lecture he said, so the Pandavas, always they were thinking of Krishna. While they were eating, while they were sitting, while they were sleeping, while they were talking, even while they were fighting, they were thinking of Krishna. This is Krishna consciousness. Just like Arjuna, Krishna was always there for him. As a result, Prabhupada said, Krishna was his friend. Krishna was always talking with him. He was always staying with him. He was sleeping with him. He was eating with him. And then Prabhupada encourages us. He said, and he says, so anyone can do that. It is possible. If you become devotee of Krishna, then you too can live with Krishna. You can be face to face with him. You can talk with him, eat with Krishna, dance with Krishna, even in this life, Prabhupada said. Even in this life. 2 times he said. Because Krishna is omnipotent, omnipotent. If you are really devotee of Krishna, Prabhupada says, one day he will talk to you, he will dance with you, he will eat with you, everything. So I thought it was interesting how Prabhupada was glorifying the Pandavas and then going on to say that if we become devotees of Krishna, pure devotees, and we can do it, then one day we can live with Krishna, we can be face to face, we can talk with him. He'll dance with us, he'll eat with us, everything. This whole wonderful world is awaiting for us. There's a saying that the material world trusts no future, however bright. That does not apply in Krishna consciousness. You can trust that your future will be very bright if you stick to the straight and narrow in Krishna consciousness. Chant your 16 rounds. If you're a Brahmin, chant your 3 Gayatris at the right time every day. Respect prasadam. Study the scriptures. Associate with devotees. Distribute the mercy to the non-devotees as far as possible. And come to Sri Vrindavan Dham and come to Kamyavan. Then it's possible to achieve that. And if one is struggling a little bit, that happens sometimes because of our previous lives, because of previous bad habits, some material desires, hiding somewhere in the heart, sometimes it may be that we may not feel so strong in Krishna consciousness, but we should never give up. We should never give up. We have to keep practicing, and that you can say that appetite for Krishna consciousness will come back again. Like when you're sick, you don't have an appetite. But when you get better, one sign that you're actually better in Ayurvedic medicine is that you have a strong appetite. So if you don't have a strong appetite for Krishna consciousness, means maybe chant more seriously, study more, associate more, pray more, just try harder. And that will come back, just like appetite comes back when you're healthy. But remain strict and never give up hope. And that is actually the wise advice of a wonderful verse I read, the last verse I read last night before taking rest, from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. And it's relevant to this, that, by being strict in our vows and our practices, we can regain our strength if sometimes it becomes a little affected. And that's in the Sri Sankalpa Kalpadruma. It's the final verse, actually, 104. And I'll finish that verse today to make sure that you all remain strong in Krishna consciousness, and we meet together again in Kartik 2021, hopefully. So here's Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's advice to all of us. He writes, giving up all desires, worship Vrindavan, the bestower of prema. If you do not have a taste for the rasa of the ocean of pastimes of Radha and Krishna, at least do not give up the desire for it. O faithless inclinations of my heart, always take shelter of the desire tree of vows. Hare Krishna. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, thank you so much. You've given us so much. We're always quoting you. The devotees relish whatever you tell us. So thank you. Srila Prabhupada, thank you for giving us Sri Vrindavan Dham. And devotees, thank you for giving me this opportunity again to share all this wonderful nectar. It's a balm which really relieves the distress that anyone may be feeling in the present situation in the world, and for whatever else comes. This Kali Yuga is going to get worse. So let's just keep this Shravanam Kirtanam going on and on and on forever. So thank you, and we'll be with you again in a few days. We'll find another blissful place in Sri Vrindavan Dham to dive into the nectar. Shishi Gaurnitai ki, Shishi Krishna Balaram ki, Shishi Radhashama Sundar ki, Vrindavan Ishwari Shrimati Radharani ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Kamyavan Forest ki, 5 Pandavas ki, Mother Draupadi ki, back home back to Goloka Vrindavan Dham ki, Jai Jai Sisi Radhe, Sham Sham Sham, Shri Vrindavan Dham ki, Hare Krishna.